A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macaulay. A new episode every single day. Episode 18, Pyre and the Immolation Part 2. As the sun crested the peaks, the tone of the camp shifted from whispered mutiny to public performance. Attalus approached the pyre, the gold leaf hilt of his broadsword catching the sharp morning light. He moved with a calibrated arrogance, casting a handful of premium frankincense, procured from the costly eastern trade routes, into the smoldering gaps of the timber. As the resin bubbled and hissed, releasing a thick, cloying smoke, Attalus's calculating gaze drifted past the corpse, toward the heavy leather tents housing the royal treasury. A dead king is a spent coin, he thought, a ghost of a smirk threatening the corner of his mouth. The live ones are the ones who pay the mercenary bills. He looked back at the princes, his eyes lingering on Perdiccas's white knuckles, openly gauging how easily the boy's crown could be cracked. He stepped back into the ranks, his heart thrumming with the chaotic potential of the morning. The regent is obsessed with his pyre, Attalus thought, his hand brushing the hilt of his sword. He thinks the fire will consume the king's body. He has no idea that the real fire is already here, and it's going to burn everything he has left. The match was struck. The air smelled of ozone and impending butchery, and for the first time Attalus felt the intoxicating weight of destiny. By the time the sun hit the zenith of the arena, there would be no more room for regents or whispers or funeral rites. There would only be the steel and the reckoning. Then, a deafening equine scream shattered the silence of the necropolis, ripping through the heavy air like splitting iron. The pure black stallion that Alexander had loved most, his primary vehicle on the battlefield, a towering mountain of muscle and glossy coat, was dragged to the foot of the pyre by thick hempen lines. The beast was wild, armed with an extraordinary feral instinct. It sensed the copper stench of mortality saturating the soil. It smelled the myrrh on its master's shroud. The stallion reared violently, its massive front hooves striking the void, its nostrils flaring into blood-red caverns as it thrashed against the handlers. The ropes groaned, biting into white skin until the horse's sweat ran like foam. The chief priest, moving with a fluid, terrifying precision, stepped directly into the apex of the beast's panic. He didn't hesitate. With a single, deeply practiced sweep of his scarred arm, he drove a jagged, heavy iron blade across the stallion's thick throat. The skin split with a sickening wet pop. The stallion did not instantly drop. It gasped, a wet, bubbling wheeze escaping its severed windpipe as it buckled heavily to its knees. From its torn carotid artery, hot, near-black blood erupted in a violent, pulsating fountain. The crimson torrent hissed as it struck the parched limestone stones of Aegae, instantly turning the white dust into a thick, bubbling mire of mud and foam. This was the ancient blood offering, executed with absolute, archaic brutality, to ensure the Argead king would not enter the silent halls of Hades on foot. Standing in the front rank, Philip felt the hot, sticky spray of the discharge strike his pale cheek. The droplets sizzled against his skin, a visceral shock of dying warmth in the static heat of the afternoon. The raw, overpowering metallic smell of iron and horseflesh assaulted his senses, thick enough to taste on his tongue. But the 14-year-old prince did not flinch, and he did not raise a hand to wipe it away. Leaving the dark, thickening stain of the blood caked on his skin like a warrior's paint, his slate-gray eyes remained unblinking, tracking a solitary figure stepping into the center of the bleeding ring. Ptolemy of Aloros. The regent held a massive, heavy torch soaked in pine pitch that roared and hissed like a wild animal straining against a chain. The exploding orange sparks danced wildly within Ptolemy's dark eyes, his distorted silhouette cast against the ancient stones, making him appear like an arrogant titan clawing his way out of a jagged rift in the earth. He waded through the pooling, steaming horse blood, his heavy military boots making a wet, sucking sound as he stopped directly in front of Queen Mother Eurydice. The thermal backdraft of the flame whistled violently between them, whipping her black lace veil against her face. "The previous reign has concluded, Queen Mother," Ptolemy said, his tone flat and administrative, devoid of the theatrical flourishes one might expect from a usurper. It was the voice of a man who dealt in ledgers and muster rolls, rather than grand gestures. Change, however, requires a finality that the people can see. I intend to provide it. Let us light the pyre and begin the transition. Eurydice stared at the usurper who had defiled the central throne and turned her sanctuary into a hollow vault. Her eyes burned with a hatred so concentrated it threatened to scar his retinas. She drew a sharp, ragged breath, pulling the full weight of a mother's curse from the absolute bottom of her lungs. "Ignite the timber, Ptolemy," she hissed, her voice cutting through the roar of the torch like a razor. "But by the eyes of that burning wood, remember my words. Fire destroys every single thing it touches, reducing existence to anonymous ash. It will consume even your arrogant hand that now holds that torch." Dismissing her words as the empty, desperate rhetoric of a defeated house, Ptolemy offered a mocking, half-formed bow. He turned with a sudden aggressive sweep of his torso and violently thrust the pitch-soaked torch into the dry base of the massive timber framework. For the few heartbeats, there was only a low, hungry murmur. The flame licked greedily at the spilled unwatered wine, the rendered bull fat, and the thick honey that coated the lower logs. It crawled like a nest of golden vipers, sizzling as it hit the dark pools of the stallion's blood. Then, a sharp, rhythmic snapping broke out as the heat found the dried cedar resin hidden deep within the timber joints. Small pockets of wood exploded with micro cracks that sounded like the breaking of finger bones. The smoke was a dense, suffocating black column at first, twisting upward like a violent vine around Alexander's ivory skin. Then, the pyre breathed. A sudden mountain draft swept down from the Pierian peaks, feeding the smoldering belly of the structure. The gradual crawl vanished. With a terrifying, catastrophic roar, the flame turned from orange to a blinding, incandescent white. A colossal atmospheric detonation boomed through the entire expanse of the necropolis, as the internal gases of the cedar logs ignited simultaneously. An overwhelming apocalyptic pillar of fire exploded toward the night sky, a towering cyclone of pure, ravenous heat that seemed to punch a hole straight through the low-hanging clouds. The sheer ferocity of the thermal wave was a physical blow. It struck the front rank of the king's companions heteroi with such violence that men who had stood their ground against Illyrian phalanxes recoiled backward, cursing as they shielded their blistering faces with their leather-wrapped arms. The hair on the horses' manes singed in an instant, filling the air with the stench of burning wool and fur. The Macedonian knight was instantaneously slaughtered by that violent release of energy. In its place arose a terrifying, artificial day, a blinding, aggressive glare that turned the high limestone walls of Aegae, the color of raw, stripped human bone. The shadows of the living were stretched into grotesque, elongated monsters that danced frantically across the tombs, while the colossal fire continued its mad upward trajectory, threatening to violently pull the very stars down into its ash. The heat became a physical assault, a furnace blast that stung the eyes and turned the throat into a scorched channel of ash and grief. Philip stood transfixed, his gaze locked onto the pyre. The flames did not merely burn, they performed. The fire whipped and shrieked, a golden demon clawing at the heavens, its roar drowning out the world. To the casual observer, it was a funeral. To Philip, the fire was a violent, wordless manifesto. He stared into the inferno, hypnotized by the way the flames writhed and screamed, convinced that the heat was shouting the secrets of power and ruin directly into his marrow. The air in the necropolis was no longer air. It was a shimmering, dehydrated vacuum, sucked inward by the pyre's insatiable hunger. The heat pushed against the watchers like a physical wall, turning the faces of the noble houses into masks of sweat and grit. Gygia, the second queen, stood like a statue carved from obsidian. Her three sons, Archelaus, Aridaeus, and Menelaus, clustered behind her in the shadow of her skirts. The roar of the flames drowned out the morning chants, but to them, the noise sounded like the grinding of gears, the machinery of a kingdom crushing its own masters. "Look at him," Gygia whispered, her voice a thin razor-edged thread that cut through the furnace blast. She wasn't speaking of the corpse, she was speaking of the crown that had already been consumed. "Look at the price of arrogance. It is not just the gold that melts, it is the entire legacy." She gripped Archelaus's shoulder, her fingers digging deep enough to bruise. "The throne is not a seat, boys," she said, her eyes fixed on the white-hot center of the inferno. "It is a trap perfectly baited. If a king does not possess the mind to calculate the geometry of his own survival, if he lacks the sharp, cold genius for internal court wrought on the brutal clarity of military maneuvering, he is merely fuel. Alexander played at power, but he failed to map the terrain. He thought he was the player, and he didn't realize he was the piece being moved until the final stroke. Archelaus stared into the fire, the orange light dancing in his eyes, reflecting a cold, hungry clarity. She's right, he thought, the heat singing his skin. The crown isn't a prize. It's a target painted on your head. Once you sit, you are no longer a man. You are a carcass surrounded by vultures, court sycophants, rival barons, and the endless, ravenous borders of Hellas. Argead and Menelaus, standing smaller and more fragile, shivered as a gust of heat washed over them, carrying the scent of charred bone and cedar. Argead looked from his mother's steel hard profile to the fire. "Is it always like this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Must we always be the prey?" "Only if you lack the teeth to be the predator," Aegae replied, her gaze drifting toward Ptolemy, who hovered on the periphery like a shadow. "To sit that throne is to live in a constant state of war. You are surrounded by 1,000 knives, all waiting for the moment your heartbeat falters. You thrive or you are erased. You crush or you are trampled. There is no middle ground and there is no rest." Archelaus didn't look at his mother. He looked at the embers swirling upward, tiny sparks of light being carried into the indifferent black sky. He felt the weight of her words settling into his marrow like iron ore. Survival is a strategic discipline, he mused, the lesson of his half-brother's death burning into his mind. Ptolemy thinks he has won because he holds the strings. He thinks the game is about who stands the tallest. He doesn't understand that the game is about who can see the board 3 moves ahead of the slaughter. "We will not end up as ash," Archelaus said, his voice quiet, steady, and terrifyingly certain. The three brothers stood as one, their faces illuminated by the violent, transformative glare of the blaze. In that furnace, the boy princes were being forged. They watched the pyre and learned the ultimate lesson of the Argead line. The throne was not given to the righteous. It was taken by the smartest and kept by the bloodiest. The pyre was no longer a monument of timber. It was a screaming pillar of gold and obsidian, devouring the night. The heat was a physical weight, pushing back the cold Aegean air and turning the faces of the onlookers into masks of melting wax. Philip stood closest to the flames, his skin scorched by the radiant intensity. He did not blink as the gold-leaf sarcophagus and the intricate carvings of his brother's life bubbled and blackened until the metal ran like tears of molten light. There, Philip thought, his eyes tracking the way the crown slipped from his brother's charred brow and vanished into the heart of the blaze. That is the truth of it. All the lineage, all the prayers of the priests, all the weight of the throne, it is just fuel for a fire that does not know his name. "It burns fast," Perdiccas murmured, his voice thin and barely audible over the roar of the consuming timber. "They said it would take hours. It will be gone by the time the games begin." Philip turned slowly, his face illuminated by the chaotic orange flickers. To any observer, he looked like a boy mesmerized by destruction, but inside, he was measuring the wind. "Everything good in this kingdom burns fast, brother," Philip said, his voice deceptively soft, carrying a jagged edge of coldness. "That is why the region is so strained. He thinks he can hold this fire in his hands. He thinks that, if he manages the ritual correctly, the kingdom will simply stay. He doesn't see that he is merely a man standing on a slope, trying to stop an avalanche with his own 2 feet. Philip gestured toward Ptolemy, who stood a few paces away. The regent's hands were twitching, his eyes darting toward the perimeter where the phalanxes had locked into suffocating, immovable blocks. "Look at him," Philip whispered, leaning in so only Perdiccas could hear. "He isn't posturing, he's calculating. He's realized that the foundation of his regency is crumbling as quickly as these timbers. He needs us to stay. He needs the tradition of this funeral to keep the army from fragmenting. But every log that turns to ash is another minute of his control over this valley slipping away." "He isn't a monster," Philip mused, glancing toward the dark silhouette of the northern peaks where the Illyrian archers waited. "He's just a man who tried to inherit a storm and is now shocked to find that it's tearing him apart. He thinks this is a funeral, but we are all simply standing on the edge of a new world, waiting to see who survives the fall." "He is waiting for us to weep," Philip continued, his gaze returning to the inferno. He felt the searing heat against his chest, a sensation that made him feel terrifyingly, vibrantly alive. He needs to see the royal heirs bowed and broken so he can justify his stewardship. So, weep, Perdiccas. Let him see the boy. Make him believe he has mastered the situation. And when he is fully consumed by the burden of keeping this dying order upright, Philip thought, his resolve solidifying, when he is standing at the center of that arena, trying to hold the pieces together. That is when we will see who the fire truly belongs to. Don't look at the body, Philip instructed, his eyes never leaving the white-hot core. Look at the sparks. Watch how they fly. That is where we are going. He gripped his brother's shoulder, a gesture that looked like comfort, but felt, to his own senses, like the cocking of a hammer. Burn, he commanded the fire internally. Burn it all until there is nothing left but the black ground. I'm tired of waiting for a legacy. Today, I will be the one to claim the light. Beside him, Eurino fought a war against her own anatomy. She stood rigid, shielding her heart with a veneer of stone, but the sight of her brother's form darkening, blistering, and vanishing into the heat proved too much. A single, jagged sob tore from her, cracking the mask. Not like this, she whispered, the words barely a breath, lost in the roar of the climbing flames. You were meant for the sun, not for the ash. Tears carved clean, shimmering tracks through the soot and ash on her face. She wiped them away frantically, her hands shaking, refusing to let the weakness linger. She watched with a harrowing, morbid devotion, her eyes burning with a mixture of agony and the first cold flickers of vengeance, tracing the path of her brother as he was consumed. They stare, she thought, feeling the weight of the Macedonian lords watching her from the periphery. They watch to see if the daughter of the house will break. They wait to see if the royal line has finally turned to brittle, useless cinder. She straightened her spine, her fingers digging into the fabric of her black lace gown until her knuckles turned ivory. Let them look, she murmured to the empty air, her inner voice hardening, forging itself into something sharp enough to draw blood. Let them gorge themselves on the side of my grief. They think they are watching the end of an era, but they are only witnessing a transformation. My brother is burning, yes, but he is also leaving the stage, and I am the only one who knows what he has left behind. She looked toward Philip, her gaze locking with his for a fleeting, dangerous second. In that silent exchange, the grief in her eyes shifted, cooling rapidly into a mirror of his own lethal intent. You see it, don't you? She mused, her heart finally steadying into a rhythmic, icy beat. The pyre is not a grave, it is a signal. The moment the last of him vanishes, the mourning ends. Then the hunt begins. He is not gone, she said aloud, her voice ringing out with a sudden startling clarity that silenced the nearby courtiers. She spoke not to the priests, but to the ghosts and the vultures circling the edges of the necropolis. He is only becoming the fire that will consume those who dared to watch him die. Perdiccas, however, was silent. He waited for the stinging heat behind his eyelids to overflow. Expecting his own tears to betray the weakness he felt deep in his marrow. Yet they refused to fall. Instead, a chilling, iron-hard resolve calcified in his chest, hardening his pulse into a slow, deliberate drum. As he stared into the heart of the blaze, the heat warping the air into a shimmering, distorted veil, he felt a sudden, profound shift, the violent death of the boy and the birth of the monarch. They are here, he realized, his breath hitching. In the flickering, chaotic light, he saw them. Alexander, proud and predatory, stood just beyond the reach of the embers, and beside him, the ghostly, shimmering visage of their father, Amyntas. They were not weeping. They were waiting. The realization struck with the force of a cold blade against the spine. He was no longer a prince in line for a throne. He was the king, and the king was currently a prisoner of the regency, suffocated by Ptolemy's desperate, trembling grip. You look small, little brother. Philip whispered close to his ear, his voice a low, mocking thread. Does the fire frighten you? You look like you're ready to scream. Perdiccas did not turn his head. He kept his gaze locked on the inferno, his face a perfect, porcelain mask of docility. I'm only mourning, Philip, he replied, his voice devoid of the tremor he felt inside. A king must know how to stand still while his world burns. It is a lesson in patience. Let them believe I am a puppet, Perdiccas vowed, his eyes reflecting the inferno with a steady, eerie calm. Let Ptolemy measure my weakness and use it to drape his own ego. I will play the fool until he truly believes his strings are attached. I will smile while he dances, I will nod while he barks his pathetic orders. And then, When he has leaned his entire weight upon my shoulder, I will step aside. He allowed a flicker of vulnerability to cross his features, a calculated tremor of the lip that he knew would satisfy the watching spies. Yes, watch me, he thought, his blood singing with the cold, patient fire of his ancestors. Watch the boy king break. And when you finally see the crown, remember that it was forged in the same heat that consumed my brother. I will break you, Regent. Not with a shout, but with the silence that follows. The pyre had reached its crescendo, the timber now a skeletal, glowing cage of white-hot embers that defied the night. The heat was no longer a sensation, it was an absolute law, bending the light ends, suffocating the oxygen, until the very act of breathing felt like an intrusion upon the gods. Eurydice stepped forward, leaving the protection of the shade. The searing radiance turned her black gown into a shroud of starlight and shadow. She stood before the inferno, her face unmasked, her eyes reflecting the destruction not with terror, but with the cold, predatory appraisal of a sculptor looking at raw marble. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over the silent, mesmerized assembly of lords, mercenaries, and spies. When she spoke, her voice did not rise to match the roar of the fire. It fell, dropping into a register so sharp and icy that it seemed to dampen the flames themselves. The fire has spoken, Eurydice announced, her voice resonating across the plaza with the authority of an oracle. She gestured toward the pyre, where the gold leaf mask was now nothing but a molten smear in the center of the white-hot core. It has taken what was ours, and in doing so, it has revealed the emptiness of those who claim to be his guardians. Look upon this ash, Macedon. This is the stability you were promised. This is the peace that comes when the Argead blood is spilled by shadows. She pivoted, her eyes locking onto Ptolemy. The regent stood paralyzed, his torch now a blackened, dead stick in his hand, his features sagging under the weight of the spectacle he had ignited. Do not look away, Regent, she commanded, her tone a velvet-covered blade. You demanded this right. You insisted on presiding over the transition. You have fueled the pyre, now you must own the void it leaves behind. She lowered her voice, a whisper meant only for the inner circle, vibrating with the power of a woman who had already discarded her own soul to survive. You think you have burned a king today, Ptolemy, she whispered, her gaze tracing the jagged, blackened remains of the timber grid. But you have only burned the veil. You have stripped away the last pretense of order. When the sun rises and these ashes are cold, you will find that you are not standing upon a throne, but upon a trapdoor that has already been sprung. Burn, then, she thought, her internal pulse a steady glacial rhythm as she watched the last of her firstborn vanish into the spark-filled dark. Burn until there is nothing left of the past. I have fed the fire everything I loved so that I might forge a weapon out of what remains. She felt the proximity of Philip and Perdiccas, the hard, vibrating tension of them at her back. She did not look at them, she did not need to. She could feel the shift in their posture, the way the boyish tremor had evaporated, replaced by the rigid, terrifying stillness of predators in the tall grass. The distraction is complete, she mused, her thoughts a final, lethal calculation. The lords are paralyzed by the spectacle, the regent is blinded by his own performance, and the Thebans are watching a corpse while the living are already breaking their chains. Let them think I am a grieving widow. Let them think I am shattered by the pyre. She turned her back on the inferno, her movements possessing a regal, terrifying grace. I am the one who lit this stage, she reflected, her heart a cold, unyielding stone in her chest. I have buried my heart in that ash, and in its place I have planted the hunger. When the games begin, when the first man falls, they will realize too late that the funeral was never the end. It was the prologue. And God help them, I will be the one writing the final act. To be continued in episode 15, Threshold of the Great Ancestor. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 5 to 15-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below. In the ancient world, history is forged by both raw violence and cold ambition. Which force truly drives the rise of an empire? The blade that cuts down a king, or the brilliant mind that designs the strategy?